The House of My Mother, Summary and Analysis. Shari Franke's Story. Ruby Franke. 8 Passengers and the Meaning of Her Memoir. How Shari Franke Took Back Her Story. The House of My Mother, A Daughter's Quest for Freedom, is a memoir by Shari Franke, the eldest daughter of Ruby and Kevin Franke, and one of the children featured in the enormously successful family YouTube channel 8 Passengers. The memoir is important for one reason beyond the notoriety of the Ruby Franke case. Shari had spent much of her childhood having her life interpreted for the public by somebody else. This is her attempt to reverse that arrangement. The big idea of the book. The central conflict in The House of My Mother is not simply between a cruel parent and a mistreated child. It is between authority and reality. Shari grows up in an environment where her mother controls not only what happens, but increasingly what events are supposed to mean. Punishment can become evidence of love. Obedience can become evidence of goodness. Resistance can become evidence that the resistant person is morally defective. That dynamic matters because children depend heavily on their parents to explain the world. When the same person causing distress also controls the moral vocabulary used to interpret that distress, recognizing what is happening becomes extraordinarily difficult. Then another force enters the family, YouTube. The Frankes become public figures through 8 Passengers, eventually accumulating millions of followers. The household now possesses 2 realities at once: the private family Shari experiences and the public family viewers consume. Finally comes Jodi Hildebrandt and Congiance, a coaching and counseling system that gives increasingly extreme behavior an intellectual and moral framework. The memoir follows Shari as she slowly learns to distinguish those things. Being told something is loving does not make it loving. Being told something is moral does not make it moral. Being filmed does not mean you consented. Being a daughter does not require surrendering your judgment. And escaping control physically does not automatically remove the way that control has colonized your thinking. The story in one flow. Growing up inside Ruby Franke's world. Shari begins with childhood, rather than with the sensational endpoint familiar to anyone who followed the criminal case. That choice is crucial. Ruby Franke did not suddenly become significant to her daughter when she was arrested. Long before she became a notorious figure in news reports, she was Shari's mother and therefore one of the most powerful people imaginable in a child's world. The family belongs to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and faith provides an important structure around family life. Shari does not reduce everything that went wrong to religion, however. The more important problem is what happens when parental authority, moral certainty, and religious language reinforce one another. Ruby emerges in Shari's telling as demanding, unpredictable, and intensely concerned with behavior. Approval matters. Disapproval matters more. Shari learns the advantages of compliance early. She becomes responsible, organized, and highly attuned to expectations. These qualities later help her survive and eventually separate herself from the family system, but initially they make her exceptionally useful within it. When a child concludes that good behavior creates safety, perfection can become less of a personality trait than a survival strategy. Shari tries to understand what her mother wants and then deliver it. The trouble is that standards controlled by another person can keep moving. The family becomes content. In 2015, Ruby launched 8 Passengers, documenting life with Kevin and their 6 children. The project grew astonishingly quickly. At its peak, the channel attracted roughly 2.5 million subscribers, while the family's routines, punishments, birthdays, arguments, milestones, and ordinary experiences became material for public consumption. Success altered the household in ways that went deeper than money. A camera changes behavior even before it starts recording. Moments that would once have belonged exclusively to the family could now become episodes. Children were not merely children. They were recurring characters within a highly successful media product. Shari became conscious of how strangers saw her. Some viewers compared her with Ruby, a particularly difficult association as Shari's understanding of her mother changed. The problem with family vlogging, as her memoir gradually establishes, is structural rather than dependent solely on whether individual parents have good intentions. Adults can understand contracts. Adults can understand permanence. Adults can decide whether exposure is worth money or fame. A young child cannot meaningfully assess what it means for embarrassing, intimate, or emotionally charged episodes from childhood to exist permanently for millions of strangers. Yet the child supplies much of the product. Years later, Shari would become an outspoken critic of family vlogging, arguing from experience that children's privacy and autonomy are too easily subordinated to the interests of the adults controlling the channel. She has described her own changed view of the practice as fundamentally ethical, rather than merely personal. Success does not make homes safer. One of the memoir's most important corrections to the simplified public version of the Franke story is chronological. Jodi Hildebrandt becomes enormously important, but Shari does not portray everything troubling about her upbringing as beginning with Jodi. Ruby already possessed a capacity for harshness. That distinction matters. Otherwise, the story becomes psychologically comfortable. A normal mother encounters a sinister outsider, becomes brainwashed, and transforms. Shari's account is more disturbing because it suggests that Jodi intensified patterns and supplied language that could justify them, rather than creating every damaging tendency from nothing. The polished online version of Ruby therefore coexists with a more volatile private version. The contradiction becomes increasingly difficult for Shari to ignore. Millions of people are watching an apparently successful parenting operation. Inside it, Shari is learning to predict moods, avoid conflict, and remain useful. What looks like maturity from outside can sometimes be hypervigilance from inside. Shari becomes part of the machine. As 8 Passengers grows, Shari is old enough to understand parts of its operation, yet still young enough to remain subject to her parents' authority. She even launches her own YouTube presence. For a time, participation in online life therefore cannot be divided neatly into victim and perpetrator. Shari likes aspects of it. She understands its appeal. She participates. She can benefit from visibility, while simultaneously losing privacy because of it. That complexity strengthens the memoir, because it avoids pretending that exploitative systems always feel exploitative every minute. The internet provides attention, status, income, and opportunities. Those rewards make boundaries harder to recognize. In recounting her own involvement, Shari also confronts an uncomfortable question. If she was unhappy about being turned into content, what does it mean that she sometimes helped create content involving her siblings? Her answer is not self-exoneration. It is one of the memoir's more important ethical insights. Children can participate in systems they are not mature enough to evaluate. That is precisely why responsibility belongs with the adults. Chad's punishments expose the cracks. As the family grows more prominent, Shari's brother Chad increasingly clashes with Ruby. His resistance creates one of the clearest contrasts between Shari and her brother. Shari survives partly by complying. Chad resists. Neither response should be mistaken for evidence that one child is stronger. They are different adaptations to the same power structure. Eventually, Chad is sent to a wilderness program and subjected to escalating restrictions. Among the most notorious punishments, he loses access to his bedroom and sleeps on a beanbag for approximately 7 months. The remarkable part is what happens next. The punishment becomes public. In a May 2028 Passengers video, Chad mentions sleeping on the beanbag, prompting widespread outrage among viewers. People who had previously accepted the Frankes as strict but wholesome parents began looking differently at old material. The same footage could now mean something else. Sponsors and subscribers reacted. Public criticism intensified. Child Protective Services became involved. The apparently solid wall between the Frankes' private disciplinary culture and outside scrutiny started cracking. For Shari, however, outside recognition creates another psychological complication. Imagine spending years adapting yourself to a system, and then watching strangers suddenly announce that the system is abnormal. Relief is possible. So is confusion. If outsiders are right, then much more of your childhood must be reconsidered. Jodi Hildebrandt enters the family. The relationship with Jodi Hildebrandt accelerates the story. Hildebrandt was a counselor and founder of Confusions, a program organized around ideas including truth and distortion. Those terms become extraordinarily powerful inside the Franke household. On the surface, distinguishing truth from distortion sounds reasonable. But in Shari's account, the framework increasingly operates as a closed system in which the authority figure can decide what counts as reality. Once that happens, disagreement becomes self-defeating. If you agree, the authority is correct. If you disagree, your disagreement can be classified as proof that you are trapped in distortion. That structure makes genuine argument almost impossible. Jodi gains greater access to the family. Ruby becomes increasingly committed to connexions. The program's worldview starts influencing decisions throughout the household. Shari is suspicious. But recognizing that something feels wrong is not the same as possessing enough power to stop it. Control becomes psychological. Punishment changes character. The environment becomes increasingly concerned with extracting lessons, enforcing supposed accountability, and defining ordinary childhood behavior through moral categories. One Christmas becomes a particularly revealing episode. The two youngest children are denied presents, while their siblings receive theirs. They are made to experience the celebration from the outside, and later deal with the discarded wrapping. Shari objects to the logic. Her resistance does not change the decision. Why is this episode so revealing? Because the punishment is not simply deprivation. It transforms affection into a moral scoreboard. Christmas presents normally symbolize inclusion, affection, and family membership. Removing them in front of siblings turns that symbolism into a disciplinary instrument. Love becomes something that can apparently be earned or lost through compliance. That lesson is much bigger than Christmas. Public criticism makes Ruby more certain. The collapse of public approval does not immediately cause self-reflection. Instead, criticism can reinforce the belief that outsiders simply do not understand. This is where the memoir begins resembling an account of ideological radicalization, as much as a family memoir. When a belief system teaches people that external disagreement proves their righteousness, negative feedback loses its corrective function. Ordinarily, criticism provides information. Inside a closed belief structure, criticism becomes confirmation. That dynamic helps explain why the public backlash to 8 passengers does not simply restore normality. Ruby becomes more deeply connected to connexions. Jody's authority increases. The circle narrows. The family becomes more isolated. Jody moves closer. Jody's presence eventually becomes extraordinarily intimate. Her role is no longer equivalent to that of an ordinary therapist consulted periodically. She becomes embedded in the Franks' domestic life, and increasingly central to Ruby. Shari describes the relationship between the women as unusual and struggles to understand its exact nature. She later said that she discovered messages suggesting physical affection between Ruby and Jody, although she did not claim definitive knowledge that their relationship was romantic. That distinction matters. Speculation about their relationship should not be converted into established fact. What can be established is more consequential anyway. Jody becomes extraordinarily influential over Ruby. Ruby's relationship with Kevin deteriorates. Kevin becomes increasingly separated from the household. Shari watches the family structure that once seemed permanent dismantle itself around congeons. Shari leaves for university. University gives Shari something psychologically revolutionary: distance. Leaving an authoritarian environment does not instantly reveal everything that was wrong with it. Sometimes the first experience is simply the absence of constant pressure. There are choices. There are people who do not interpret disagreement as rebellion. There are relationships in which affection is not endlessly conditional. There is privacy. As Shari encounters ordinary independence, the Franke household begins to look stranger from outside than it did from within. This is one of the memoir's central mechanisms. Freedom becomes a comparison point. You cannot always identify control, while control is the only environment you know. Once an alternative exists, differences become visible. Mother and daughter move toward estrangement. Shari's growing independence brings her into direct conflict with Ruby. The relationship deteriorates as Shari questions what is happening and refuses to accept congeons unquestioningly. Eventually, she becomes effectively separated from her mother and younger siblings. That separation is devastating because escape creates a moral problem. Shari can protect herself by staying away. But what about the children still inside? She becomes increasingly concerned about their welfare. This places her in a position familiar to many survivors of controlling families. Distance provides safety while simultaneously creating guilt. Returning exposes her to manipulation. Staying away can feel like abandonment. There is no clean option. Shari tries to get authorities to listen. Shari begins trying to raise alarms. She contacts authorities because she fears for her siblings. But one of the most frustrating elements in the memoir is the difficulty of translating a pattern into something institutions can act upon. Outsiders usually encounter fragments: a single punishment, a single conversation, a single visit, a single allegation. Inside abusive systems, however, meaning often resides in accumulation. One incident might be rationalized. 20 incidents reveal a structure. Shari knows the structure because she lived inside it. Authorities do not possess her years of contextual knowledge. This gap between lived understanding and institutional evidence becomes one of the book's quietest sources of tension. The confrontation with Ruby. After contacting Child Protective Services, Shari confronts Ruby. The conversation encapsulates the central tragedy of the memoir. Shari is not confronting a stranger. She is confronting the woman whose love she spent years seeking. That makes resistance psychologically different from ordinary disagreement. Shari tries to articulate that protecting her siblings is not an act of hatred toward her mother. She still wants Ruby to change. She wants recognition. She wants reality acknowledged. Yet there comes a point where continuing to seek parental approval risks making independence impossible. This is where the house of my mother becomes less about defeating Ruby than about Shari ceasing to organize her life around Ruby's judgment. The family splits apart. Eventually, Ruby's involvement with Jody becomes consuming. Kevin is separated from Ruby. Shari is outside the household. Contact with the younger children becomes extremely restricted. The 8 passengers' world effectively collapses. Yet the danger inside does not collapse with the brand. This is another important distinction. Public visibility had been one of the family's problems, but visibility also created outside scrutiny. When the family's online presence diminished and isolation increased, outsiders had fewer opportunities to see what was happening. The disappearance of the camera did not automatically restore the children's privacy in a healthy sense. It could also make suffering less visible. August 2023 changes everything. The event that finally breaks through does not come from YouTube viewers, Shari, or an institution successfully interpreting warning signs. It comes from one of the children escaping. On August 30th, 2023, Ruby's 12-year-old son escaped from Jody Hildebrandt's house in Evans, Utah, reached a neighbor and asked for food and water. The neighbor saw his condition and called emergency services. Authorities subsequently found evidence of severe physical injury and malnourishment. Another child was located and rescued. Ruby Franke and Jody Hildebrandt were arrested. The Washington County Attorney's Office later stated that the children had suffered serious physical and emotional abuse, and that religious extremism had been used to justify the treatment. For the wider world, the arrest is a shocking revelation. For Shari, its meaning is different. She posts an image of a police vehicle accompanied by one word, finally. The word became famous because it compressed years into 7 letters. To people encountering the story through breaking news, something extraordinary had just happened. To Shari, something she had feared was finally being recognized. The arrest does not produce a simple happy ending. When someone has spent years trying to persuade others that something is wrong, vindication can sound like relief. But the thing proving you right may be catastrophic. The arrest means the younger children are finally outside the immediate environment. It also means Shari must confront how far circumstances had deteriorated. There is no victory capable of making those years disappear. The legal process confirms some of the external facts. Ruby pleaded guilty in December 2023 to 4 counts of aggravated child abuse. Jody Hildebrandt also pleaded guilty to 4 counts. On February 20th, 2024, both received 4 consecutive prison terms of 1 to 15 years, with Utah's indeterminate sentencing system leaving the ultimate length of incarceration to the Utah Board of Pardons and Parole. Utah authorities describe the effective sentencing range as 4 to 30 years. The criminal case therefore supplies legal recognition. Shari's memoir deals with something the court cannot adjudicate: what happens to the daughter afterwards. Shari refuses the simplest version of Ruby. Perhaps the hardest question in the memoir is whether Ruby was transformed by Jody, or whether Jody merely intensified something that already existed. Shari resists the comforting answer. Ruby's behavior was troubling before connexions. That matters because blaming everything on Jody could restore an idealized version of the mother Shari wanted. If Jody alone caused the catastrophe, perhaps the real Ruby remains recoverable underneath. Shari cannot fully accept that construction. Jody matters enormously. She provided ideology, reinforcement, and escalating influence, but Ruby still made decisions. That distinction preserves moral responsibility. It also forces Shari to grieve something harder than simply losing her mother to another person. She must reconsider who her mother had been all along. The main people inside the story. Shari Franke. Shari is simultaneously narrator, witness, and former participant in the family brand. Her central transformation is epistemological before it is emotional. She learns to trust her own interpretation of reality. As a child, she tries to become good enough to maintain approval. As a teenager, contradictions accumulate. As a young adult, physical distance allows comparison. Eventually, she acts even when action risks permanent separation from her mother. Her achievement is not becoming fearless. It is accepting that fear cannot be allowed to determine what she calls true. Ruby Franke. Ruby is the memoir's most complicated figure because she occupies several roles simultaneously. She is Shari's mother. She is the public face of a successful family business. She is the primary disciplinarian. She becomes a Jones coach. She is later a convicted child abuser. Reducing Ruby to only the final category would make the memoir easier, but less illuminating. Shari's difficulty comes from the fact that attachment survives knowledge. Children do not automatically stop wanting their parents because their parents behave badly. That contradiction explains why separation takes time. Jody Hildebrandt. Jody functions as both a person and a system. Her importance lies partly in her relationship with Ruby, but also in the vocabulary she introduces. Concepts, such as truth and distortion, give moral certainty to increasingly extreme judgments. Jody's influence demonstrates how language can transform power. Control becomes counseling. Isolation becomes boundary setting. Punishment becomes growth. Disagreement becomes distortion. Once harmful behavior acquires therapeutic or spiritual terminology, challenging it can become harder because the vocabulary itself appears respectable. Kevin Franke. Kevin occupies one of the memoir's more uncomfortable positions. He is not presented as the principal architect of Shari's treatment, yet his inability or unwillingness to stop the trajectory matters. That raises a wider question running beneath the book. What responsibility belongs to people who are not driving an abusive system, but continue participating in it? Passive participation still shapes outcomes. Eventually, Kevin himself becomes separated from Ruby as Jody's influence deepens. But Shari's experience does not disappear, simply because he too was subjected to elements of the system. The younger children. One of Shari's most ethically significant decisions is how little she claims ownership over her siblings' stories. The memoir is about her experience. Although their treatment is inseparable from the family history, Shari generally avoids turning her siblings' most painful experiences into entertainment. A review of the memoir noted that the younger siblings are deliberately left unnamed, and that Shari largely restricts herself to what belongs to her own story. That restraint directly opposes the logic of family vlogging. The younger children finally receive something the internet rarely gave them: the right not to become content. The moment everything changes. The obvious answer would be Ruby's arrest. Narratively, however, the deeper turning point occurs earlier. It happens when Shari stops treating reconciliation with Ruby as the condition required before she can believe herself. For years, the fundamental structure is vertical. Ruby judges. Shari responds. Ruby defines. Shari explains. Ruby approves or rejects. Shari adapts. Independence begins when that hierarchy loses legitimacy. Once Shari accepts that her mother can be wrong about her, Ruby loses something more important than physical access. She loses interpretive authority. That is the memoir's real liberation. The ending explained. The memoir does not end by restoring the Franke family. That would contradict everything Shari has learned. Instead, freedom means accepting that a relationship can remain broken even after the truth becomes publicly undeniable. Ruby's arrest does not repair childhood. A guilty plea does not recreate trust. A prison sentence does not supply the apology or understanding a daughter may have once wanted. Shari moves toward a future, defined less by what Ruby does next. She has said outside the memoir that she does not want the case or the trauma to consume the rest of her life. She can hope that Ruby receives help, without making Ruby's recovery her responsibility or requiring reconciliation. That is an important distinction. Forgiveness, reconciliation, contact, and freedom are not synonyms. A survivor can wish somebody well and still refuse to give that person access. The memoir's title therefore becomes clearer. The House of My Mother describes both a literal childhood home and a psychological territory. For years, Shari lives within Ruby's interpretation of the world. Leaving the house ultimately requires leaving that interpretation too. What the book is really about: conditional love. One of Shari's deepest wounds comes from learning to associate approval with performance. Behave correctly. Be responsible. Follow expectations. Do not embarrass the family. Do not challenge authority. The difficulty is not merely that those expectations are demanding. It is that love becomes difficult to distinguish from compliance. A child begins asking, "What must I do to remain acceptable?" That question can survive long after the parent disappears. The ownership of childhood. Family vlogging creates one of the book's sharpest moral problems. Who owns a child's childhood? Legally, parents possess extraordinary authority over their children. Economically, parents can build businesses around family life. Technologically, cameras can turn a child's most vulnerable moments into permanent public artifacts. But ethical legitimacy is another matter. A toddler cannot understand digital permanence. A 9-year-old cannot meaningfully negotiate commercial exposure. A teenager who grew up believing filming was normal cannot retroactively recover the privacy already surrendered for them. Shari's argument against family vlogging becomes powerful precisely because she lived both sides. She knew the excitement. She knew the money. She knew the audience. Then she grew old enough to understand the cost, the danger of closed systems. Koenigsegg illustrates a broader phenomenon, extending far beyond the Franke case. Any ideology becomes dangerous when it develops mechanisms for making itself unfalsifiable. If success proves the system works, and failure proves you did not follow it properly, the system cannot lose. If agreement indicates insight and disagreement indicates distortion, criticism cannot penetrate. If outsiders disagree because outsiders are unenlightened, isolation begins feeling virtuous. At that point, ordinary safeguards stop functioning. The system has converted contrary evidence into support for itself. Why outsiders miss abuse. Public reaction to 8 passengers also demonstrates how difficult abusive environments can be to interpret in fragments. Many individual incidents could initially be rationalized as strict parenting. The lunch incident. A removed bedroom. Restricted privileges, harsh language. One episode may produce discomfort without revealing the whole mechanism. Patterns matter. Context matters. Power matters. Most importantly, the child's inability to leave matters. The memoir asks readers to stop evaluating parental behavior only by whether a single punishment sounds survivable. The better question is what system the punishment belongs to. What most summaries miss. The most important part of The House of My Mother is not Ruby Franke's arrest. Everyone already knows the headline. The revelation is how normalization works. A harmful family system rarely introduces itself by announcing that everything familiar is wrong. It develops incrementally. A child adjusts, then adjusts again. The next escalation is judged relative to yesterday, rather than against a healthy baseline. This is why Shari's university years matter as much as the criminal case. Distance resets the baseline. She meets people whose families operate differently. She experiences privacy. She gains control over daily decisions. Behavior that once felt inevitable starts appearing abnormal. The memoir is therefore a study of comparison. Sometimes freedom begins when you discover that the rules governing your life were never universal rules at all. What most people misunderstand. A shallow reading divides the story into 2 eras: Ruby before Jodi. Ruby after Jodi. The first is supposedly normal. The second is supposedly corrupted. Shari's account complicates that version. She makes clear that serious problems existed before Jodi Hildebrandt became central to the family. Reports in later interviews have reinforced Shari's contention that the abuse did not simply originate with Jodi, even though her arrival dramatically worsened the trajectory. This does not minimize Jodi's role. It prevents Jodi from becoming an explanation so complete that everybody else's choices disappear. Influence and responsibility can coexist. Someone can be manipulated and still cause harm. Someone can be vulnerable and still have power over people more vulnerable than themselves. The case becomes more useful to understand when those truths are allowed to coexist. The strongest scene or idea. The most powerful idea arrives through the simplest public reaction. Finally, Shari's response to the arrest works because it reverses the perspective of the entire case. The public saw discovery. Shari experienced confirmation. The public saw a shocking ending. She saw the interruption of something she had been trying to stop. That single difference explains why survivor testimony can sound emotionally strange to outsiders. Relief at an arrest. Relief at estrangement. Relief when a family collapses. Those reactions appear contradictory only if preserving the appearance of a family is assumed to be more important than protecting the people inside it. The tailored interpretation. The most useful way to understand The House of My Mother is as a book about who gets to name reality. Ruby has parental authority. YouTube gives her narrative authority. Connexions supplies ideological authority. For much of Shari's childhood, those forms of power point in the same direction. Ruby can impose the rule, explain the rule, and broadcast the version of events in which the rule appears justified. Shari's eventual independence dismantles those powers one by one. She leaves home. She questions the ideology. She rejects her mother's interpretation. She tells authorities what she believes is happening. Finally, she writes the memoir. Seen this way, publishing The House of My Mother is not merely telling the story after escaping. Telling the story is part of the escape. For years, other people possessed the camera. Now Shari controls the frame. Why this book still matters. The Ruby Franke case is extraordinary. The structures beneath it are not. Millions of children now grow up with adults documenting their lives online. Therapeutic language increasingly enters ordinary conversations. Influencers build parasocial relationships with audiences who may mistake visibility for intimacy. Online communities can reinforce extreme beliefs rapidly. Children remain heavily dependent on adults for both physical security and explanations of what normality looks like. The book therefore belongs to several conversations simultaneously. It is about child abuse. It is about family influencers. It is about coercive control. It is about belief systems. It is about privacy. It is about parental power. And ultimately, it is about becoming sufficiently independent to decide that somebody you love can still be wrong. If you only remember 3 ideas. 1. A perfect public image tells you almost nothing about private power. 8 passengers allowed millions of viewers into the Franke household, while simultaneously failing to reveal the full reality of that household. Visibility and transparency are different things. Sometimes the existence of an audience produces more performance rather than more truth. 2. Control becomes harder to resist when it controls the vocabulary. Connexions did not merely prescribe behavior. It supplied categories for interpreting disagreement. That is much more powerful. When authority gets to define opposition as evidence of moral failure, people can lose the conceptual tools required to resist it. 3. Independence begins when approval stops being the test of reality. Shari does not become free because Ruby finally agrees with her. She becomes free when Ruby's agreement is no longer required. That distinction may be the memoir's most important lesson. The sentence that explains the book. The House of My Mother is the story of a daughter learning that loving someone does not require allowing them to define what is true. The real-life test. The easiest mistake is to read Shari Franke's story as something that could happen only inside an exceptionally dysfunctional family. The mechanisms are much more ordinary. Watch what happens whenever one person possesses disproportionate authority over both decisions and explanations. A manager makes an unreasonable demand and then decides that objection proves an employee lacks commitment. A partner behaves badly and then declares that questioning the behavior proves disloyalty. A community leader interprets criticism as evidence that the critic is morally compromised. A parent decides not merely what a child must do, but whether the child's feelings about it are legitimate. Different stakes. Same structural warning? Ask 4 questions. Can I disagree without being punished for disagreeing? Can evidence change the authority figure's mind? Can I maintain meaningful relationships outside the system? Am I allowed to describe what happened using my own words? If the answer repeatedly becomes no, the problem is no longer merely disagreement. It is control over reality itself. 5 questions to test whether you understood the book. Why is it misleading to explain Ruby Franke's behavior entirely through Jodi Hildebrandt's influence? How did family vlogging change the boundary between childhood, family life, and commercial content for Shari? Why was leaving for university psychologically important, even before Shari achieved complete separation from Ruby? How did the Connexions framework make disagreement with authority more difficult? Why does Shari's eventual willingness to live without her mother's approval matter, more than whether the relationship is ever repaired? The final lesson. The darkest element of the house of my mother is not that millions of people watched a family online, without fully understanding what was happening inside it. It is that the children themselves had been given a framework that made understanding their own experience difficult. That is how control becomes durable. It does not merely restrict what people can do. It teaches them to mistrust what they see, what they feel, and eventually what they know. Shari Franke's escape, therefore, cannot be measured simply by the distance between herself and Ruby. The deeper achievement is reclaiming the right to interpret her own life. The child who once appeared inside somebody else's family story eventually becomes the person telling it, and she no longer needs permission.